Hi, I am Bryce Covert. I am Economic Policy Editor at ThinkProgress.
And I am Steiger, Associate Editor at Talking Points Memo.
And this is the third edition of Blogging Gingers, I think.
I think so.
Fittingly, right after St. Patrick's Day, however, I'm not Irish. Are you Irish?
I am also not Irish.
So, there you go. And I stayed indoors yesterday to avoid the harassment. I don't know about you.
Yeah, it's weird. Sometimes people get really creepily insistent that you must be Irish, and it's a little weird.
Yeah. Also, like all the drunken people. Someone was telling me they saw drunk firefighters in dress uniform at Times Square in the subway station, and I was like, "Go New York." Good job.
Yeah, I think I'm too old for that.
Yeah. So we have a lot to talk about, but we can start out with the Paycheck to Paycheck documentary that just aired on HBO this week, and is also, you can watch it for free online, which is how I did it because I don't have HBO. But I thought it was really compelling. But I don't know. Do you want to sort of start out with your thoughts about it?
Yeah. So my understanding of Paycheck to Paycheck is that it's produced in part by Maria Shriver's people and organization, sort of to get at some of this stuff. She's released a big report about, the gender pay gap and issues particularly affecting women. And this documentary had originally started, I think, as a profile of a sort of pre-K school for poor kids in Tennessee or Georgia. I'm not actually sure where it's located. But it's sort of right in that sort of deep South. And the filmmakers, I guess, started following this woman who is sort of the star of the documentary, and she's a white woman in her late 20s, early 30s. She actually turns 30 during the documentary. And she has 3 children. She works as a healthcare aide in a nursing home. And it just sort of goes through her daily struggles of managing the kids, trying to buy groceries, dealing with her separated husband, her new boyfriend, just sort of what her life is like. She's very patient. She works with the kids. She's always thinking about things that she can do for them. And I think a big part of her existence is sort of navigating the social safety network. She talks a lot about, like, we have food stamps now, we lost them, how can we get them back? She talks about, she applies for financial aid, and for reasons that are unclear, her financial aid application is rejected when she's trying to apply for a radiology program that would presumably increase her earnings potential. So, I thought it was really compelling and a really good way of sort of looking at how there are these things that affect so many people that, we really don't pay attention to, as a society. And there are people who are going through these struggles every single day. And I thought it was a really humanizing way of looking at, what has basically been maligned as, dependency programs.
Yeah, I had the similar reactions. I think what really struck me was telling the story of a woman like this who is living very close to the edge of poverty, if not technically in poverty, a single mom in the South, trying to hold down a job, like you said, sort of trying to juggle these different relationships and figure out which ones are going to support her in which ways. And I was sort of struck by how, I think when we talk about work-family balance, the image I will admit that I usually get, and I think a lot of people get, is sort of like an upper-middle-class woman, professional woman who needs, maybe to telecommute or to change her work hours, maybe to take a little time off and then come back into the workforce after she's taken care of her kids. And the work-family balance that is depicted in Paycheck to Paycheck is like work-family survival. The things that she's juggling it really feels like everything is constantly up in the air and moving around. You get this sense that, like, if this thing doesn't work out, it has a domino effect with this thing, and then if this thing doesn't fall through, like, there's a scene where she's in the car and she gets a call from the school saying her daughter has a low-grade fever, and she goes through this thing like, oh my God, am I going to be called out from my job tomorrow? What's that going to mean? And then she's like, oh wait, my ex can take her, and then but her son gets upset, and it's like this little game of like musical chairs in her life, constantly trying to get things to pay for. And she has a bunch of health problems. She finally goes to the doctor, and it's like she goes to get her prescriptions, and it's way too much money. So which ones do you buy and which ones do you not buy? It's like these constant choices between this thing and that thing, and never quite having enough for all of them. It was like work-family balance has a totally different meaning when it's everything is cut so close to the edge, you know?
Yeah, and it absolutely touches on so many different aspects of the social safety net. We talked about the food stamps. We talked about the federal financial aid, the support for going to college. But there are a lot of other issues too. For instance, she talked about how her kids have healthcare. She has her kids on Medicaid, but she couldn't afford healthcare for herself as a person who is a healthcare professional. I read a later interview with her that said, thanks in part to sort of the Obamacare and the Medicaid expansion, she was able to get healthcare for herself. So that's a really great story. And, I guess another school offered her a full scholarship, so she was able to attend school in that way. After that things that happened after the fact of the documentary. But I think the other thing is, really, I thought it had a good, even though, she's sort of the star of the documentary, the reality of sort of white working class men is really a key part of that. She talks a lot about how her ex had traditionally done factory work, and, most of those factories were no longer in the United States anymore, so he was really stuck. He didn't know where to find work, and he ended up living much further away from his children, because there he could live with his mother, who lived 2 hours away, and it made it really logistically difficult for her to hand the kids off to him. And even her, her new boyfriend, who I think, it was unclear what his role is, but I think he either worked at a Walmart or some other kind of retail profession like that. And, he similarly was like, if I get sick, I passed out from dehydration, I wasn't able to go to work. These kinds of things are what the issues that people, sort of living on these margins are really dealing with every day.
Yeah. And I thought the men in the documentary were really interesting, particularly her boyfriend Chris. When you meet him, he has his 4 daughters, and they're living with him full time. And then when the star of the documentary, Katrina, moves in with him later on. Spoilers, sorry. It ends up that he ends up in a custody battle, and the girls move out. And what's really interesting, there was an article in The Atlantic recently that was just basically talking about how our anti-poverty programs assume dads aren't involved with their kids. And you can almost see like how when the dad gets removed almost physically from the children, it's so much harder for him to figure out, what are the programs that he can use? Now he has to pay child support. How is he going to see them? How is he going to pay for his house? Like, it seems a lot harder for him to pull everything together. And they both admit, if he has to start paying child support, Katrina's going to be the breadwinner, and they're going to have to rely almost entirely on her paycheck. Whereas she's facing a lot of challenges, but it's almost like the children are the anchor to her life, and she gets the services for them, and then she comes in after that. And it's like, it almost felt like the men were so much less rooted because they weren't sort of being folded into their children's lives in the same way.
Yeah, and it just raises a lot of questions, like if you're sharing custody of your kids, how do you split up food stamps in a way that makes sense? How do
Right.
you, decide, who gets to pay for gas money and, those kinds of things when you're trying to, share custody of children, which, I think a lot of conservatives would say, well, people should stay together, but that they just talk about how he had a substance abuse problem and they got married so young. Those kinds of things are just all factors of life, and it's really unfortunate that the social safety net is sort of not designed for the way families live now.
Yeah, there's a scene where she drops off her kids with her ex. This is when he's living far away from them, and she basically is talking about the food stamps that they get. And you're right, like he has to come up with the money otherwise. So she gives him some money for gas, and it's like this really awkward thing. I mean, thank goodness they're on like kind of good terms.
Yeah, no kidding.
But yeah, and then I mean, it just has to be said too that like so many points in that documentary make it clear that all like if she was just given a little bit of a boost up in some capacity, she would be probably able to swing things a little better. Like if she makes, I think it's $9.50 or something like that an hour. If she made some like a little bit extra money, or if she could take a paid sick day and wouldn't have to worry about her kids, or like she doesn't get paid sick days, like any of those little things you can tell would have such an incredibly profound impact on her life. I think when we talk about things like minimum wage and paid sick days, it's important to remember that for people like Katrina, it has such an intense impact. It's not a small change in their lives.
Absolutely. And just one more thing I wanted to mention about Paycheck to Paycheck. The one thing that really struck me about watching this is we really obsess almost about whether or not people who shouldn't be getting benefits are getting benefits. And, we've cut back a lot on various social welfare programs where, there's a lot of concern about welfare fraud and, people getting food stamps to buy lobster and, stuff like that. But when you think about it, I feel like we should almost be erring on the side of, well, there's going to be some people who abuse this program, yes. But there are so many more people who need just a little bit more help, a little bit more assistance. And those people would really benefit in a lot of ways from it. And I just think you have to be planning these social programs for the Katrinas of the world and not sort of the stereotype of the college student who's using food stamps to buy lobster.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's so many more Katrinas than lobster buying food stamp recipients anyway, that if you err on her side, you'll be helping so many more people and not capturing a whole lot of, like surfers who just, use food stamps to get by.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, so I guess to switch gears pretty quickly.
Yeah.
One of the things I wanted to talk about that's been going on this week is the pretty high profile exit of Julie Horvath from GitHub. To give a little background on what happened, Julie Horvath was a pretty prominent employee at GitHub, GitHub being a tech company, and I'm not even going to pretend to understand entirely what they do. It's like very technical coding. And she was a big promoter of women in tech and trying to boost women inside of GitHub. And over the weekend, she sent out a bunch of tweets basically saying she had left the company and it was because of harassment that had been going on for a while and hadn't been addressed by management. She didn't say a whole lot in the details, but talked to TechCrunch in a follow-up, and basically, you should read the TechCrunch article if you want all of the details of it, but basically she was being harassed by higher-ups and made to feel uncomfortable. She had a personal relationship with another employee at the company, and that was sort of dragged into everything, and she felt like she was sort of being ridiculed for it publicly, and it went unaddressed, and it got to the point, she said in the TechCrunch follow-up, the tipping point for her when she decided to stop trying to fix GitHub and to leave GitHub was watching some female colleagues who were hula hooping, which she said, she had no problem with, but then she noticed that there was sort of a bench of male coworkers who were just gawking at them. And she just felt that it was very uncomfortable and very inappropriate. When she brought it up, they didn't see a problem with it. And she said, that was when I decided I need to leave. So she's landed a new thing, but there was a couple interesting things for me here besides just, this is another incident where we're seeing women struggling in tech and not being welcomed into that culture and it being very growy and often discriminatory. One interesting thing for me was that she was so public about it. I think probably a lot of women know other women who have experienced some harassment at work. And I would say a lot of people do not have the ability to come forward with it either publicly, like on Twitter, or, seeking out legal recourse, either because it's hard to document, or you don't want to risk your reputation, or you don't want to risk your job, or whatever it is. I think the odds are really stacked against all this stuff coming to light. And so I was actually really impressed that she felt comfortable enough in her career that she was able to take it public, because I think it's good when this stuff comes to light. The other thing that I thought was really interesting was that GitHub responded, and basically, you can argue that it's too little too late, and I definitely see the merits of that, but for a response from a company that's been basically accused of not responding to harassment, it was a pretty good response. It basically said, we've put the people who were accused of harassment on leave, and we're investigating it, and we wish Julie well, and we're very sorry. And it didn't get defensive, and it didn't slander Julie, and it didn't, sort of say she's a liar and she's crazy, which I feel like a lot of the responses tend to be. So, you should jump in, but I thought both those things were super interesting.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, and I think based on my conversations with some other women who work in tech, not a super uncommon experience.
Yeah.
So I agree. I'm super glad that Julie felt comfortable enough to be public about it and talk about it and prompt her company to respond. I eagerly await to see if GitHub will make any of the results from the investigation public, or ultimately what happens to the accused harassers. Because I think, we'll see, GitHub gets a lot of credit for, saying that they're going to take this on right now, but if, ultimately there are no consequences and, and they never really address what happened, then, that's not a great outcome either. So I do genuinely hope and believe that GitHub has its heart in the right place. So I just hope to see that follow up from it ultimately.
Yeah, and I think it's also worth pointing out that she made it public, but she hasn't taken legal recourse. And I'm not a lawyer, but I would sort of assume that if what she experienced actually went down, that she might have some grounds. And I think it's interesting. On the one hand, she's brought this to light and she's moved on and she's doing other things with her career. On the other hand, if we don't make use of those, sort of legal rights we have to address discrimination, which actually, if she were able to win something, could, in theory, hold GitHub more accountable. Is that a statement on where we are in terms of, you can talk about it and you can maybe take action against it, but you can't sort of force a company to be held accountable to it in sort of a legal way.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I've always found to be really interesting about the arguments against protections for workplace discrimination is a lot of the conservative argument centers around, threats of frivolous lawsuits and things like that. And I think, again, the idea is, the conservative idea is you're so obsessed with protecting against the fakes that you ultimately end up eliminating protections for the people who need it.
Yeah.
And in many ways, anti-discrimination laws aren't about the lawsuit. It's more about encouraging companies to have the right kind of behavior, to have the right policies in place. That sort of quote unquote fear of a lawsuit. A lot of women who maybe experience harassment aren't eager to bring forward legal action. But, the idea of workplace protections is that the company is being proactive and not and making it so that you don't have to bring forth that discrimination lawsuit in the first place.
Right. The hope is that the laws enact enough penalties and make it easy enough in theory for people to bring lawsuits that then no one has to bring a lawsuit, because that's enough to hem in the behavior on its own. Like the Paycheck Fairness Act, for example, which still has not passed Congress, one of the things it would do is make the definition of what's acceptable pay differentials between men and women stricter, so that you can get away with less and you have to really have a good excuse for paying men and women differently. And then it enacts heavier fines. And both of those are not really meant to punish, but more to try and prevent. And I think that's really key, because how many women have the resources to get a lawyer, have the time that they can take to devote to bringing a case like that, aren't worried about what it would do to their career and their reputation? You know, it's really such a risk to bring a lawsuit that I do think the laws have to be more about dissuading companies from taking those steps in the first place.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But anyways, I think you're right. I think that it'll be interesting to see what comes. First of all, I'm interested to see what she does next. I'm also curious to see what comes at GitHub. And I hope that, you know, there's still women who work there, and I hope that, if anything, they're at least taking steps to make sure those women who are still there are comfortable, and that women who are interested in GitHub feel comfortable coming there. Because I feel like, you know, one potential repercussion of this whole episode is that people see what happened to Julie, people see GitHub not have to necessarily take steps, and then they say, well, I don't know if I want to work there. Or maybe they extrapolate and they say, maybe tech is not a friendly place for me to try to go. You know, like, I hope that being public about this is a way to make these places friendlier to women, so that more women come out, and it's not just about, you know, treating the women who are there well as well, you know?
Yeah, and it just kind of goes to show that the idea of creating a culture that is friendly not just to women, but to people of color, to, you know, people of diverse backgrounds, is something that you really have to work at. And it has to do with making sure that you have leaders of diverse backgrounds all the way up the chain. You know what I mean? You need folks who, you know, can think about, is this a problem? You know, like you said, the fact that, you know, she reported this and, you know, the higher ups were like, I don't know what you're talking about, is really a sign that, you know, when you're talking about diverse hiring practices, it needs to be really all the way up.
Yeah, and proactive too.
And proactive, absolutely. Yeah. So, let's see. So, interestingly, let's relate this to something slightly different. But, you know, Julie was really brave in bringing forward her conversation to the public sphere. And there's sort of a similar thing on a different topic in another realm. There was a Twitter conversation that happened late last week about sort of this one woman who had been having a conversation with someone on Twitter. She has sort of thousands of followers, and she was like wondering why, you know, folks mention clothing when they talked about victims of sexual assault. And, you know, she just asked her followers, you know, let me know if you feel comfortable coming forward and saying to me, you know, these are, if you're a victim of sexual assault, do you mind sharing just what you happen to be wearing when it happened? And the responses were really moving, actually. There are a lot of people who just came forward and said things like, you know, I was wearing a t-shirt and jeans, you know, some people saying, you know, talking about their sort of sexual assault they experienced as children, you know, and the responses were so varied and so heartbreaking. I thought it was a really effective way. And, you know, she asked if it was okay to retweet these responses, and she ended up, you know, retweeting a bunch of them. And people who were willing to come forward really busted this myth of this idea that the victim is somehow to blame based on what she is wearing.
Right.
and this is related to some work that activists have been doing around something called a slut walk, which is where women who, I think it started on a college campus in maybe Vancouver, where women, get out and they, say, if you insist on calling rape victims sluts, like, here we are. We are victims of sexual assault, and a lot of women come out wearing, sweatpants or t-shirts, jeans, casual clothing. And the idea is just that it doesn't matter what you're wearing. It doesn't matter who you are or what you are doing. You are ultimately a victim of sexual assault, and the other details simply don't matter. So I thought it was a really effective way of sort of getting at that. It ultimately sort of ended up spiraling, though. There was a lot of journalists started noticing that this was happening. I posted about it on Talking Points Memo. BuzzFeed did a write-up where I think they asked permission of the folks who had been retweeted if they could republish the tweets and then republish them. But then it ultimately ended up being sort of a backlash about sort of what is public on Twitter. Can you treat a tweet just, as public when you're talking about sexual assault in a news article? And I think, it really spiraled from there because obviously Twitter is a weird medium. There are a lot of people who are on it who may have public Twitter feeds, but not really think about it as a public medium. So I thought it was a really interesting debate. I didn't republish the tweets. I simply, encouraged folks to find them and read them on their own. But I did think it was an interesting conversation about both about the myth busting of rape victims' clothing and, also about what Twitter is as a medium and what it means for journalists versus regular people.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the tough thing about Twitter is that it is public and it has this power and this pitfall of being public, right? I mean, I think what's powerful about this campaign, or I don't know if you can call it a campaign, but this sort of action of people talking on Twitter about what they were wearing when they were assaulted is that it is public. And, you can get a hashtag going and you can bring lots of new people in who don't necessarily follow you by getting them, retweeted and spread into other people's feeds. I've seen a lot of really interesting stuff like that. I remember Steph Harold did a hashtag that was I had an abortion, and it was somewhat similar where people were just asked to tell the story of their abortion and tag it I had an abortion, and it was really powerful to hear everyday people coming together and talking about these things that happen to them, and it's myth busting because it's real people and the assumptions that we have about it sort of fall away. But these are also sensitive topics, and I sympathize a little bit with the idea that it's, you, particularly if you're someone who is not a public figure, who has a Twitter account, for literally socializing, because it's a social media, that when you tweet, you don't think of it in the same way as someone who has, tens of thousands of followers. And to have your tweet put on BuzzFeed brings a whole lot more attention than you might have been expecting. That said, I mean, I think I probably come down on the side of, Twitter is public, tweets are embeddable, and if you don't want it to be public, don't put it there or make your account private so that it is actually private. So, I think we just have to be aware when we're using the power of the publicness of Twitter to do these really interesting and moving things, that's what it can do, that it can draw a lot of attention and it can draw trolls. It often, almost always draws trolls,
Yeah, absolutely.
So, yeah.
Yeah, and I do really encourage folks who are interested. The woman who was tweeting about this goes by the handle Stacy Fox, Stacy with an I, and I encourage folks to read it and check it out.
Yeah, I'm not gonna remember exactly where it was, but there was a photo essay too that was a similar thing where I think it might have been mostly like young women or college women who were asked to dress in what they wore, and then I think they were holding signs saying, like, this is what I was wearing when I was assaulted. It was also really powerful. I mean, I think this idea that anything you're wearing or doing is it really grips so many people that this is what if you just, because I think it's, it's not just about victim blaming. It's also about a false sense of comfort where, if I just wear a t-shirt and jeans, I'm safe. Or if I avoid a bar, I'm safe. Or if I don't walk alone at night, I'm safe. And the reality is that's probably not true. So, yeah.
Absolutely. And I mean, even the New York Times got caught up in this when they described what I think it was a 10-year-old or, a very, very young victim of sexual assault was wearing. Yeah. And it created a lot of backlash. And so I think it's just important to acknowledge that these are biases and traps that a lot of people fall into, and I really admire the work of folks who are challenging those assumptions, and admire the victims who are willing to come forward and be public with what happened to them.
Yeah, definitely.
And you wanted to talk about something of yours.
Yeah, do a little shameless plugging. I wrote a long piece for ThinkProgress on paid sick days last week, sort of going back to a topic that actually came up a little bit in Paycheck to Paycheck, because I've been following this pretty steady progress at the city level and a little bit at the state level to pass paid sick days laws. For those of you who may not follow this closely, the United States is one of the only developed countries that does not guarantee that all workers can take a paid day off if they're sick or if one of their children or family members is sick. And that means that actually a lot of people don't have paid sick days. It's in the millions. And so there have been local governments who have decided to take action on this. There are 8 laws right now, 7 cities and 1 state, the state of Connecticut, that have guaranteed paid sick days. So, and a lot of those victories have actually come recently. And I was curious about not just what this means on sort of the obvious level. I mean, you pass a paid sick days law, and that means that people can take a paid day off for themselves. It means they're not putting their pay or their job at risk when they're sick. And a lot of the people who can't take paid sick days are in food service, which is not good for anyone, or something where you're in close contact with the public, where if you're going to work sick, you're going to get everybody else sick.
Absolutely.
But whether there was a larger ripple effect from paid sick days, and what inspired me to ask this question was that I know that research has showed that paid family leave has these larger impacts. When you guarantee paid family leave, and particularly give it to men, and even if you go further, some countries like Sweden have gone further and sort of made it use it or lose it dependent upon men. So men are sort of forced into taking some paid leave when they have a new child. That it has this transformative power for gender roles, that men become more involved with their children, that they sort of bond with them more. And then also when men and women go to work, there's sort of equalized expectations about who's going to take some time off to be with a new child. Mm-hmm. But I didn't know whether paid sick days was a similar thing, so I did some asking around, and it turns out that it's a little bit different, but that there are some larger ramifications that I actually thought were really interesting. So the first was that it has an impact on gender roles because it's non-transferable. If I have 5 paid sick days, I can't give them to a partner. So men and women are both sort of incentivized to leave work and take care of a sick parent or a sick child. And it also sort of just normalizes the idea that workers should be given the right to take some time to care for themselves and to care for others, and that's something we support. It changes employers' views of their workers, which was really interesting. A lot of employers worry about these laws, like you were sort of saying, there's sort of this worry that the exception, that the people who are going to be the outliers are going to ruin it for everyone. If some people are going to abuse it and take like hangover days or just use up all their days, it can be really costly for businesses. And it's sort of this like distrust of your workers, that they're just going to try and take advantage of you. And then they find out that doesn't happen. Very few people take all the days that are afforded to them. Most people take 2 or 3 days. And so that has like this softening effect on the way that you view your workforce. And then the last effect that people were talking about was sort of this like solidarity effect, which I thought was really cool, where, you and I, who have sort of quote unquote professional jobs, are the kinds of people who tend to have paid sick days, and people who have them sort of assume everybody has them, even though they don't. And then when you start to learn that people don't, and then we say, but we're going to give them this benefit and make it a right, there's a sense that my job is similar to your job, and now we have this standard that we share, and this sort of sense of solidarity between me as a white collar worker and, you know, whoever's making my coffee in the morning or caring for my kid while I'm at work.
Absolutely.
So I thought I'm just always into ways that public policy transforms culture, because I think that it really has the power to do that. And it turns out paid sick days is one of them.
Yeah, and I think that second point you made about the way it changes employers, you know, sort of goes back to many of the themes we were talking about, that you can't worry about the few people who might try to take advantage of the system, and instead you're better off making the system about most of the people who will end up using the system correctly, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And then also, I think that there's often these sort of overblown fears before something's enacted that it's going to be full of fraud or be this, you know, huge boondoggle. And then, you know, human nature tends to not play out that way. People don't tend to take advantage of it. They use what they need, I think, by and large.
Yeah, and, you know, you can always adjust a policy to have more sort of ways to make people honest. There are always ways to adjust the policy, but it's worth trying it out and seeing how it goes first.
Yeah. And I also think we just have a culture in this country of wanting to support yourself and to be self-sufficient. Actually, something that really struck me, the opening of Paycheck to Paycheck, is Katrina pointing to a tattoo of a bird, and she says something, it's got the word something like fly by myself or fly by my own power or something. And I think people in this country, like, to an overwhelming degree, have a real drive to be as independent as they can. And so when people are using, you know, public assistance programs, I tend to assume that they are using them because they need them, not because they want to.
Yeah, and I think there are a lot of folks who use public assistance who actually are really against folks, you know, abusing the system. You know, yeah, I've seen many interviews with you know, folks who are really dependent on food stamps or other social welfare programs who, you know, disparage other people who they feel are, you know, just taking advantage and being lazy and things like that. So I think you can't think about folks who use these programs as a monolith. You know, obviously there are some folks who are really hardworking and using these programs because they need to, and there, of course, will be a small minority of folks who, you know, will get by on what they need to get by. But I think you see those types of people in all spectrums of classes.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't get too eager to say that it only happens with people on public assistance.
Yeah, definitely. Cool.
But that's a great piece. Everybody should go read it.
Thank you. Although our site has been down all day, so go read it tomorrow. When the site's back.
When ThinkProgress is back up, you should read it.
It's the first thing you should click on.
Yep.
Awesome. Well, that probably concludes our conversation, but thanks so much for joining me for it.
Yeah, thanks for joining me, Bryce. It was fun.
All right. We'll catch you next time for Blogging Gingers.
All right. Sounds good.
Bye.
Bye.